Hey, I'm Victoria Price. Thanks for listening to Hide and Seek. As I mentioned last week, podcasting is an odd choice for me. Because not only don't I listen to podcasts, but I'm also not entirely clear what the whole podcast deal is about. A few weeks ago on Saturday Night Live, they spoofed the Barack Obama Bruce Springsteen podcast, and in the way that SNL does at its best, spoke the obvious in a way that makes us laugh, or at least it made me laugh. When the Barack Obama character was asked what made his podcast interesting, he said, "It's real, like listening to a couple of guys talking." And Michael Che said, isn't that what a podcast is? A couple of guys talking? Yeah, a podcast is people, or a person in my case, talking, and other people listening, or at least theoretically listening to people or a person talking. But to me, the interesting question is why? Why have podcasts become so popular? And perhaps even more relevant, why do all of us think we have something to say and feel the need to say it into a microphone and then post it out into the universe in the hope that other people will listen? Well, maybe it's because we're not encouraged to speak about the things that really interest or matter to us in school or in our jobs. Or maybe it's because most of us are scared to speak about the things that really interest or matter to us, to the people we're closest to, our families, our friends, the people we're in relationship with. Either way, I think we all have things that really matter to us, that we love or that trouble us, that we've learned to hide. And yet we're all seeking answers about those things, or ways to incorporate them more fluidly, organically into our lives. And to do that, we have to share our thoughts, our feelings with others. And so that's what this podcast is all about: hiding and seeking and sharing. The other day, I went on a hike with some new friends, two couples, and listening to them talk ahead of me on the trail, I learned that they all attend the same church. So I took a risk, and I asked them a question about the Bible as it relates to a character in a book I'm finishing up. And that ended up leading into this really interesting conversation. I told them that I just read that the number of churchgoers, or people who identify with a particular religion, had dropped below 50% for the first time in American history. And all of them shared some of their own history after hearing that. One grew up as a minister's daughter, two grew up Southern Baptist, and both left, and one grew up outside of traditional religion. And then they shared some of their favorite books reconciling all the challenging stuff around religion and faith and love. For me, to be able to have that kind of conversation outside of an organization that invites those kinds of conversations felt incredibly liberating to me, because I love having spiritual conversations with anyone, but usually I never open my mouth. And so I live inside this spiritual closet, and it's lonely in here. But after last week's podcast, I had to risk coming out of hiding. You see, last week I promised to hold myself accountable to whoever might be listening to this podcast in sharing my attempts to find the balance between my instinct to hide and my constant desire to seek. And that's why I had to try talking about spiritual practice to these new friends. Now, I don't want to join their church, but I do want to be able to find the common ground between us and hear them, even as I hope I can be heard. And that happened. And it felt so liberating, all because of this podcast. You know, most of the people to whom I'm closest, with whom I enjoy talking the most or spending the most time, identify as atheist or agnostic or even church haters, because they've been so damaged by church and this whole damnation idea around church, or possibly as spiritual but not religious. But, you know, I myself am not a fan of organized religion at all. As a general rule, I believe that organized religion has tried to codify individual spiritual practice into something that ultimately just benefits people in power. And so it, like politics, becomes less and less about people and more about power and privilege and prestige and personality. And those of us who don't fit in or try to speak out are tarred and feathered or cursed to damnation or excommunicated. And then we learn to hate everything associated with religion, including the original message, which in the case of many spiritual traditions is the exact opposite of the message that churches are now trying to spread. So love gets transformed into hate, or unity becomes division, joy becomes fear. So I've been asking myself, how do I talk about the spiritual ideas and practices that matter the most to me with people predisposed to shut their ears and minds to those things? Well, that's the thing. Talking is never going to do the trick, because talking is what preachers and politicians do. They talk and they talk and they talk. Unless you agree with what they say, at best, you're going to become an outsider, or at worst, you're going to be injured by their talk. So talking is pretty much the worst thing I can do. And yet, here I am talking to you through this podcast. But this podcast is about heart-centered practice, or at least it's a podcast about the paradox of my trying to become a more honest, heart-centered practitioner by living love instead of hiding. So it's a podcast about the heart-centered practice of paradox, or a paradoxical heart-centered practice podcast, or a practice of heart-centered paradox in a podcast. Who knows? Certainly not me. But what I do know is that just talking isn't going to cut it. My friend and colleague Peter Fuller and I lead these cultural tours, and one of my favorite memories from one of those tours took place in Norwich, England. So on the night we arrived in this town in eastern England, we did a ghost tour. Now, I'm going to be honest, I thought it was going to be incredibly hokey, and also since it was November, I thought it was going to be incredibly cold. It turned out to be one of the most fun and memorable nights I've ever had. The guy who led the walk was an amazing storyteller, and he took us all over beautiful and historic Norwich in the dark, told us true ghost stories that also helped us learn about the plague and plague pits and the history of Norwich and its citizens and the church and the government and England as a whole. Plus, it was just gorgeous seeing all this incredible architecture in the dark. The next morning, I got up early and I took this long walk around the town by myself, and I saw all the same things in the daylight and felt like I'd had this experience not everyone gets. It was fantastic. Then we met up with our group, and I took them to a place I'd been really eager to see. It was called the Anchorage of a woman named Julian of Norwich. Now, Julian lived in the east of England, in Norwich, in the mid-1300s, during a time when women, of course, had precious little power or influence, and when people were dropping like flies from the plague, specifically the first and second waves of the Black Death, which killed up to 50% of the population during the 1300s in England. This decimation led to something called the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, which ended up being completely suppressed by King Richard II. So really tumultuous times. Well, Julian underwent this mystical experience and ended up being healed after almost dying. She not only ended up writing one of the most famous books ever written by a mystic, but she ended up living in a tiny cell attached to a church where she prayed and meditated, but also talked to people about their problems. She wrote one of the first books ever written by a woman that was published. So when she was dying, and she had these visions that ended up healing her, she got this really clear message. All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Why? Because we're always the loved of love. That's what her message was. And sharing that message after coming back from the dead was something, particularly during the Black Death, that people needed and wanted to hear. So I took my horror friends who were on this tour with Peter and me to visit the cell where she lived. 15 of us crammed into this tiny anchorage where she lived. And I shared how the visions she received were as gruesome and graphic and bloody as any of the horror films my traveling companions love. And that, of course, made total sense in an era where people were dying right, left, and center from the plague. Some of them, even, as we learned the night before in our ghost walk, buried alive in plague pits. We also talked about her being a woman in an era where women had no voice and no power, And we talked about the close link between what some people call miracles and what others call the paranormal or supernatural. And we talked about how her coming back from sure death to delivering a message of love changed her community and the whole world as the message went out in her book for centuries afterwards. So after I shared all that, everyone in that room shared how important they believed the message of love was, but how they'd gotten that message of love way more from the horror community than from their churches or schools or families or even communities growing up. And many of them honestly shared their damage from religious organizations and other groups that are supposed to be loving. And we all ended up agreeing that something has gone very wrong if the organizations that are supposed to make us feel loved and safe don't. And a community of people who like watching scary things feel more like family and community, and most like the people who live love. You know, that's what I've learned from the horror community. I've learned acceptance and kindness and love from this group way more than I have from most church people. The introduction to my book, Living Love, is called Where is Love? And I'll share some of it next week. But meeting and becoming friends with horror fans gave me one of my first real human answers to that question, where is love? Because I've always believed in the higher power of love. I've felt it, but humanly I've experienced and felt that love way more from horror friends because they listen to me with such open hearts and they've taught me how to listen to them. And none of us are trying to be more right or powerful than another. That's living love. I'm not right. They're not right. We're all just people. They love horror. I love spiritual practice. And their spiritual practice of creating community has helped me feel as loved as I hope my spiritual practice of listening to them and to why they love horror and what it means to them helps them feel heard. That's all living love is, showing up and sharing from our hearts instead of promulgating our own power-based agendas from our judgmental heads. The invocation of my book is this quote: I think when we wake up in the morning, we can choose between fear and love every morning. And every morning, if you choose one, that doesn't define you until the end. The way you end your story is important. It's important that we choose love over fear because love is the answer. Who wrote that quote? The Dalai Lama or Jesus Christ or the Buddha? Nope. Guillermo del Toro, the Oscar-winning director of The Shape of Water, a Mexican director in a country that often treats Mexican immigrants in monstrous ways, a man who identifies as a monster kid, someone who has always felt like an outsider. You know, about 5 years ago, I was given an award that has meant more to me than any award I've ever won, Monster Kid of the Year, awarded by horror fans, voted on from around the world. And that award meant so much to me because I don't even like horror movies, and yet horror movie fans understood that I love them and their love of the genre they love, and that we are united in that love and the love, theirs and mine, of the man who was called the King of Horror, my dad. And that's how love works. It brings people together. In the 1960s, Jesus freaks, as they called themselves, recognized that Jesus specifically didn't go seeking out religious holy people because he understood that those people felt protected by their religion, and because of that, most of them had lost their hearts. No, Jesus specifically spoke to the freaks and the outsiders and the supposed sinners and taught them that they were and always will be loved. That was his whole message. And now, ironically, Jesus is used to divide people by religious folk who make him out to be someone he never was. You know, we're all so divided lately, and the only way we can come together is to find the common ground in love, love with the big L, in living that love with the big L toward one another. That's what my book's about. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what horror fans teach me every day, and that's what this podcast is about. Coming out of hiding, trying to love myself and everyone I meet a little bit more. That's the simple truth of my heart-centered practice of living love. So, thanks for listening to this week's podcast. You can find my book, 12 Heart-Centered Practices to Transform Your Life, Living Love, on bookshop.org, or in your local bookstore, or online with the digital behemoth of your choice. I also post some short videos on Facebook and Instagram each week about this journey of mine of coming out of hiding. You can find me on social media at I'm Victoria Price. I am, as in Mary, which is my first name, Victoria Price. And thanks for listening to this podcaster who doesn't have a clue about podcasting, just trying to come out of hiding and live love. Stay tuned for next week's episode as I share my journey of hiding and seeking.